Hi, folks. I'm Ken Ween, and you're listening to It Matters Radio. And today, of course, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Monica Brinkman.
Hello, folks.
And our guest today is Stanley A. Goldman, an attorney who also has written a fascinating book called Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream, The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother. I have read the book, as I do with all the books we talk about here, and it is a very, very good book, very well worth reading, but actually something even more important about our friend today. Stan is an attorney, a very fine attorney, and he has offered to talk to us about the law, and not just, but you know, there's an overlap between the questions of law that I want to discuss today and Hitler's Germany. So the thing is, you know, what is the relationship between law and justice? And no time has that been more at question here in the United States than it is now, because we have both issues of Black Lives Matter. We have the question of whether the grand jury was properly charged concerning Breonna Taylor. And of course, we have the death of somebody that I know Monica and I held in great esteem, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the question of whether the current president, Donald Trump, should be appointing her replacement at this time, or should he wait till after the election and to see if he is reelected before doing it? And how does that connect to this issue of justice? And how can we connect that to what went on in Germany and something called the Nuremberg laws, and what's legal, what's just?
That's a lot of content, yes.
You have a year? Can we do this till next October?
I think you'd have to be on like every week. You know? All right. So, Ruth Ginsburg. Yeah, that's a big one for a lot of people. But what interests me is the parallels and non-parallels between what happened in Nazi Germany and what we're going through in the United States right now and other places in the world also. So what?
Talk to us a little, please.
Sure. Look, a lot of people are afraid to draw analogies between contemporary life and the Nazis, of course. I myself decry it the vast majority of the time when people try to say, oh, this is a genocide, oh, this is, you know, I mean, and I'm talking about things more socially, or that they're like the SS, or they're like the Gestapo, or this is like the Nazis. The vast majority of the time, in my opinion, when that is used, it is an overstatement, hyperbole, and in my opinion, extremely disrespectful to the victims of the Holocaust. But I was a history major. I've written a history book, you know, and I was always fascinated by history. I've written a few, along with, you know, I'm a tenured law professor. I had to write a lot of law review articles in my life. I've written a few history articles, and finally this book about the Holocaust, which is a memoir. But I think we, you know, the cliche of all history teachers is if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. So the fact that I myself don't think that the use of Nazi analogies are usually very helpful, and if anything, as I said, insulting, we can't forget it, and sometimes it actually applies. And clearly, if we try to put out of our minds because we're afraid it's politically incorrect, the late 1920s and the 1930s with the rise of totalitarianism and fascism in Italy, in Germany, in
Yes.
Spain, you know, in the way some of it was treated in Russia. We can't, in the beginnings of the Bolshevik Revolution, we can't learn from it. And even and by referring to it, we are not, and I am not calling anybody in American politics today a Nazi.
Right.
I'm not saying they're a Gestapo. What I'm saying is there are lessons to be learned from that period that we would be fools not to consider. And I think that's what you're bringing up.
Yeah, we should always consider those things, you know. And I mean, history is one of our greatest teachers of how to react to situations and how to prevent them also. But you know, there's people that don't even believe in the Holocaust.
Well, you know, that was one of the reasons why I spent 4 years. It's a short book, and people should understand, by the way, I'm a law professor. I've published something like 24 deep dish law review articles. I've been a law professor since I was 26. Mm-hmm. I took some time off in the middle to, as you may know, a TV news correspondent covering legal cases. And I even continue to teach during that entire period. I never had to give up my tenure. So I write law review articles. But the book I wrote, I also wrote for the New York Daily News for 2.5 years. They published 90 of my stories in the 2.5 years I worked for them. And I wrote my book, I tried to, like I wrote those stories for the New York Daily News. I tried to write it simply. I tried to explain the, things that were going on. And I think there are direct analogies to what is happening today. And one of the reasons why I spent 4 years researching what is really a relatively short book, 150 pages long, is because I didn't want there to be any question when I was gone, when survivors are gone, when the children of survivors like myself are gone.
Yes.
I wanted everything documented. I have 150 pages of text and 42 pages of endnotes just to prove that every single thing I said has a historical basis and is backed up. I'm not making anything up in this book.
Yeah, so the deniers deny it. I'm sorry.
I'm going to cut in here now because I really think it's important that we talk about law. Okay. And one of the realities is, and one of the parallels, one of the things that concerns me is that one of the first things Hitler did when he took over in Germany was basically he took over the courts. He got rid of the bad, in his words, or his notion, judges, and stacked the courts, and then applied laws that, to me, seem terribly unjust. Obviously, since they, among other things, Stan, meant that your mother could be made into a slave laborer, I'm sure you would agree they were unjust. My concern is, how do we keep our legal system? We're talking about what do we learn from history? How do we keep our legal system from being preempted and becoming a system of legality as opposed to being just?
Well, it's $1 million question. Unfortunately, I sometimes think that the autocrats, the dictators around the world, understand this lesson better. You'll notice, if you follow at all what's going on in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Hungary, you'll see when Erdogan in Turkey, when those people took over in what were democracies, thriving democracies.
Yes.
One of the first things they did was to try to change the courts, to try to staff the courts with their supporters so they wouldn't have any trouble. With all deference to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he hasn't done this to the same extent, but he too attempted to affect the courts in terms of who was going to be on the courts and what jurisdiction the courts would have, or in his case, he hoped no jurisdiction over decisions he would make. And that's true all over the world, and it is the first sign of true danger.
Yes.
Because when you can't deal and accept the fact that there is an objective system of law that binds you, the rest of us are in terrible trouble. It is not only in and of itself terrible, it is actually the first symptom of real dictatorship. Let me tell you a story here, historical event, that maybe has just occurred to me, can exemplify this, how long ago this has been true. We have 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. A lot of people think that's built into the Constitution. It is not.
No.
We had 5, we had 7, we had 9, we had 10, then we went back to 9. It's historical accident and the fear that someone would pack the courts with their own justices that led the Republican Congress in 1866 to be fearful that it was possible that in the next midterm election or at some future point, Andrew Johnson might pack the Supreme Court with his own pro-Southern, longing for the days of slavery to return justices. And so they passed a law in Congress, that was veto-proof because of the vote at the time, just in case this was going to happen, freezing the court at its present number of 9. It's just a law. You can change it with majority vote and the president's signature in both houses and the president's signature. But that even was an awareness of the fact that if you change the courts to back your position and only your position, then you are in danger. So there's a long American fear of being able to do that. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if a Democrat had one criticism of Obama and Clinton, it would be that they were very, very lax in filling positions on the federal bench. They wanted to be so scrupulous that they got people on it who were qualified, and so that they waited and waited and waited, and sometimes to the point where they no longer had a majority to get their judges through. And the idea of just putting judges on of one side, yes, who are indebted to you and bound to you is a terrifying first indicator of some form of undemocratic authoritarian rule, or at least attempt at such.
And by the way, we should remember that a guy who was very much on the liberal side, named Franklin Roosevelt, tried to change the number, wanted to change the number.
Yes.
And the Democrats, who were in majority, wouldn't go along with it.
And they may not, I'm not certain they'll go along with it with Biden. They might. I think quite a few would. And of course, Roosevelt, was not confronted with justices in the court who had been sort of slipped in through, say, contradictory statements. They hadn't blocked a Democrat, and then and then in the same exact, in fact, worse circumstances, put a Republican on the court. Also, I would say Robert Jackson, a great United States Supreme Court justice, oddly enough, the last justice to sit on the United States Supreme Court who never went to law school. He clerked, back in that era at the turn of the 20th century, but he was a great writer and a great thinker, and took a year and a half off to become the head prosecutor of the Nuremberg prosecutions, right? Mm-hmm. Well, he once said that the judiciary is a past generation's brakes on a present generation, the younger generation. It is very often an older generation trying to put its foot down and stopping something that the younger generation wants to do. And that was Roosevelt's problem. He had older justices on the court, didn't agree with his New Deal. They were trying to block it. He threatened to add more justices. I think the very threat may have had some impact, because within a couple of years, a couple of those justices retired, and some of the more famous justices of the Roosevelt court, like Black and Douglas, were appointed during that period, who were, at least in that era, considered moderates or liberals who went along with Roosevelt's program. The same thing would not happen today. With the possible exception of Thomas, who was in his early 70s and therefore still young by today's standards, but last time I read a biographical sketch of him, he was also weighing 300 pounds, so one wonders about his longevity. Mm-hmm. With that exception, these justices aren't going anywhere. The recent appointee, the one who's about to go through Congress, she's 48. If she lasts as long as Ginsburg did on the court, she'll be there for 39 years.
Yes.
This is a whole different world now.
Which opens up, of course, and how do you remove them, which then gets us into a worse place, that if you have this unlimited tenure on the bench, and you have something going on like we have had in the last 3 years, of really pushing an agenda, a political agenda, rather than making sure people are competent and balanced in their approach, what happens is then it falls on the administration and the legislature to remove, possibly, which then gets us into impeachments, which is possible.
I would think, actually, in my opinion, I would if anything were going to happen, I would much rather see expansion of the court than impeachment. Yeah, I mean, impeachment really should be for crimes and misdemeanors. And I got to admit, if there was actually found to be communication with a president or a president's, employees as to how to rule on a given case, that, in my opinion, might very well be an impeachable offense. Even though it might not technically be a crime, it would be an impeachable offense. But adding more justice to the court, I got to tell you, what the heck was the population of the United States in 1866? I mean, we had 9 justices then, we have 9 justices now. Yeah, there are just as many cases now as there were then. No, there are multiples, 100 times as many cases being offered to the U.S. Supreme Court that they should consider than there were in 1866. So in an objective world, I would say, we could use 17 justices on the court. We could use 21. There's more than enough work to be done unless you leave it all for the courts of appeal that are also relatively, fixed in number. So there are actually practical reasons to have more justices on the court. The problem is, in any given era, you're concerned that the party not in power is going to oppose the party in power being able to put those extra justices on the court. And there's a lot of impetus, even in the party in power, not to maybe shake the boat and break tradition like that. I'm just wondering if this, because of Garland and because of this new attempt to appoint a justice here while the election is actually going on, if that might actually give a president like Biden cover to say, it's time we had 11 justices. And I'll tell you what Biden could say, and I haven't heard anybody say this, so I doubt it would ever occur. But I'll tell you what, I'll just appoint 2 new justices to make up for the 2 that are appointed, and one of them will be Merrick Garland. I'll appoint Merrick Garland, I'll appoint somebody else, and you know what that's going to do? That's not going to give my side the majority. That'll make it a 6-5 vote with Roberts again as the swing vote. A true conservative, but one who is not quite as politically, it seems, in tow as the other conservatives on the court are. Now, I'm not saying that's always going to be true, but that would strike me, it would be very difficult to really pick on Biden for that kind of decision, where you don't even change the makeup of the court except to give somebody who's at least a somewhat moderate the swing vote instead of having it solid conservatives, because you create a principle, you can't appoint somebody in your last year before an election, and we'll appoint one about a week before an election. That contradiction sort of deserves some response.
Well, I think the greatest problem I had with the debacle, I call it the debacle in Ohio, as opposed to the thriller in Manila. I refer to the debate as the debacle in Ohio. And my biggest, I came right at the very beginning when this whole subject was raised by Chris Wallace, and Mr. Trump went with the line, well, elections have consequences. And, that's been a bandied about. The reality is that to me, is a rallying cry for totalitarianism. Because what really should be said is that while elections give advantage, we are still, as a civil society, as a democracy, as a republic, as a blending, as a culture of diversity, we still have a responsibility to make sure that all voices are heard and that justice is done, not partisanship.
Yeah.
And to my chagrin, Mr. Biden, who I think might believe that, but is not the world's most articulate person, let's be honest, did not jump on that.
No, Biden definitely got about a B+ for his debating skill. A B- a B- for his debating skills.
I'd say
I think I would have given him that. I will not, because of his present illness, grade the president during that debate. I'm sure if he was in the days when I used to teach what they call trial advocacy, and we'd have 2 sides, I would have probably just stopped him in the middle and said, you can't participate in this anymore. I'm going to fail you unless you change your debating style.
Yeah.
Here. But that's just on debating points. And no judge would let them get away with that in a court. I'm gonna tell
I
you.
have a question, and this affects the election. All of a sudden, with one state right now, there could be more following this tradition. They've decided, now they're a Republican state. Of course, they elected the majority of Republican representatives.
Right.
They have decided that they are going to oversee the ballots, and they are forming an election voter council, which means they're going to go into the voting facilities and look through all the ballots and toss what they feel are invalid ballots that have been handed in. How can that happen? I mean, you have a majority going in who wants to win the election, being able to toss out ballots.
Well,
at
you know,
their
I'm
whim.
I'm not certain it would be lawful, but then once again, as unfortunately I've been forced to say for generations now in my classes, the Constitution appears to say whatever the U.S. Supreme Court says it says. And this is so key here on trying to get an extra vote on the court before the election to potentially, on the Supreme Court, hear issues about this election. The reality is, if there were 8 justices on the court, even if they split 4-4, it would simply mean that the lower court decision was going to be upheld. Let's go back 20 years exactly. Let's go back to Gore v. Bush v. Gore. There, the Supreme Court voted along party lines. Actually, not even party lines, because Stevens, who was a Republican appointee, voted with the liberals on that, as did Souter, who was a Republican appointee. And they so it was basically political as opposed to party. 5 votes, conservatives, voted in favor of stopping the election in Florida, which the state Supreme Court of Florida said should continue. It was a 4-3 vote in the state Supreme Court of Florida saying the recount in Florida should continue. The U.S. Supreme Court took that case, which had been working its way up through the federal system, and ruled 5-4 that they had to stop it. And one of those votes was Justice O'Connor, the first woman on the court, as opposed to Ginsburg, who was the second. Years later, when she was off the court, she said she regretted that decision, and she was sorry they had intervened. But there was apparently a lot of pressure on her, especially from Justice Rehnquist, who apparently had great sway over her. You know, they'd been very close since law school. In fact, her time of retirement, she has basically said, was decided by Justice Rehnquist, who decided she needed to retire because he was going to be leaving the court, and they didn't want 2 conservative replacements coming up too closely together. So he asked her to resign, and she did. So they apparently had great sway. And when she left the bench, she regretted her decision in that case. Well, the same thing's about to happen. We're about to, this election could very well go into the court system. If it does, the last court to hear it and the final decision will be by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And
that's terrible.
It's just so unseemly to appoint a justice right in the middle of the election who agrees with you so you can get a majority on that court.
I know, and my whole problem with the law is when we have the right to vote and have it count, that should supersede anything.
Right.
No one
and
should be able to go in. I don't care who they are.
We're
And
right back. We're
throw
right back
our
to
votes
that
away.
topic of
I mean, why
justice.
people aren't up in arms over all this is beyond me.
Well, I think people are, and I have a friend at where I teach at Loyola. I have a colleague who's involved in on the Democratic side that has happened dealing with election issues, and believe me, the Democrats are putting together, as are the Republicans, legal teams right now to battle whatever inappropriate behavior they think is taking place, either at the election polls, sending out election ballots, or counting them. But it could be a very fierce battle. Even if this election isn't close, people keep saying, "Oh, if the election is a big, landslide." Even Pelosi the other day admitted, when asked the question, that they were preparing for a Republican strategy of battling the election so hard, if it looked like Trump had lost, that will end up in the House of Representatives and have to be decided by a majority vote in the House of Representatives. You may think that Pelosi would be happy about that because almost nobody anticipates that the new House will be anything but more majority Democrat. But that's not how the votes are counted on this issue. The votes on this issue are counted by state. So each state has its delegates of Congress people vote, and whatever the majority of that vote is, that's how that state votes. And at the moment, there are 26 Republican majority states. So Pelosi said just the other day that they are working and pouring money in to these campaigns in these swings in these states where they think they might be able to take over the majority by winning 1 or 2 Congress seats that they don't have right now.
But
who knows?
Yeah. Even if Trump got elected again, we could curtail him if we could get a majority of Democrats on the House and in the Senate.
Yes.
It wouldn't scare me so much if he got in again. And people, I'm not saying this because I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I'm saying this because what I see is someone coming in and taking away our constitutional rights bit by bit by bit. And I don't want it from any party.
But Monica, I want to remind you, that is why on It Matters Radio we have such great guests to discuss these topics. And I just want to remind, as we go to the end of the broadcast, that today we've been talking with law professor, historian, newspaper reporter, Stanley A. Goldman, who has written a memoir, as it were. It's kind of a memoir. I don't know how, because it's really the story not of his life, but of his mother's life. It's titled "Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream: The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother." And of course, in the description of the show here on YouTube, folks, you'll find a link where you can go to that to buy that book. I have read it, and it's a fascinating story. I do not recommend reading it at bedtime because, anything about that period in history. But I did want to just bring up one thing here, because it is in the title, and obviously by the very fact that Stan is with us today, his mother did survive. She is among the people who did survive. And part of the reason was that there was a bargain made. Now, I'm going to let you read the book to learn about the bargain. But one of the things that I think, since we are talking about contemporary American political life, is the ability of people to make bargains. Of course, often it involves third parties. It involves somebody from outside. And just one last thing I did want to bring on, because the bargain in your book is so important, is that we have a POTUS who claims to be a master of making bargains, and yet whose notion of bargains always seems to have involved bankrupting other people.
I have known people who've done business with Trump before, and they usually said they almost could never reach a deal with him because, they wanted guarantees and assurances to which Trump was never willing to give. By the way, let me say this because nobody else has said it yet anywhere on television or on the news. I'm just wondering if this tragic fact that our president now has COVID, and I mean that seriously. I wouldn't want to have COVID. I mean, he's a 74-year-old man. He's got issues. I just wonder how many people in his circle who've been exposed to him have also, or he himself, been exposing members of the Senate. Because I'm just wondering
Joe Biden.
if
he just debated him. Joe Biden.
Well, yeah, Joe Biden. He may have. He was 6 feet away or more from him. There is a danger. This could be a true nightmare. But I'm just also wondering about members of the Senate who are supposed to be there to vote on his next Supreme Court appointment. I wonder if any of them will not be able to show up because they're going to have to be quarantined. So the consequences of this could be extraordinary.
I remember when, not personally, I don't remember, but when Johnson was being impeached, the last vote, they had to carry the senator in on a litter. I'm going to bet that if they do have to vote, they're going to find a way to do it by Zoom or Skype or whatever.
There's some way to do it, yeah.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. I don't think it's going to block it, but,
You know,
but
there's
notice
people-
the timing on this couldn't be worse if you're a Republican, and if Biden ends up contracting this, it couldn't be worse if you were a Democrat.
Yeah.
You know,
There's
As a
people
parent-
that think it's a hoax. There's people don't believe it. They think he's doing this so he can all of a sudden say, oh, I took this medicine and it made me better.
or because he really doesn't want to debate a second time. I
Yeah.
also heard that conspiracy theory, and he doesn't want to back out, and he knows Biden can't back out, so he just wants to curtail it by saying that he's quarantined during the period of time when they'd be having these debates.
I
Let
think it's
Pence go out there and
sad.
debate.
Hey, Stan, before we run out of time,
Yeah.
because boy, we have used up. I'm going to
He's got to come back. He's got to
a
come back.
crucial question. Would you be willing to come back and
Of
talk?
course, of course.
Oh, wonderful.
Of course, and it's a wonderful conversation. Thank you. I hope I haven't talked too much. By the way, if anybody wants to look my book up, you're probably better off just looking up under Stan Goldman. That's an easier name to remember. Just think of Goldman Sachs, but without the money. Because left to the mercy of a rude stream is obviously a paraphrasing of a line from Shakespeare. So it doesn't always come trippingly from everyone's tongue. Just Stan Goldman.
We supply when we put up the podcast, we supply those links in our description to make
And
it.
by the way, it's intended as an uplifting book. It is not. My mother survived.
Yes.
She survived because of the courage of herself and the strength of herself and the group of women she was with. That group survived. They made it all the way through the war, through Auschwitz, and they were. The book is written because they were rescued in perhaps the strangest rescue of anyone from a death camp in the history of World War II. I didn't learn it till years after my mother died. I did some research, I discovered it, and I finally, after reading for myself and researching it, decided I just had to write this.
Wow.
I thought it would take me 8 months. It took me 8 years to finish the
Remarkable
book.
woman. And I'm so happy you decided to write about it.
Yes, and
I
I'm
know it
so
was
happy
hard
I got to
because-
read it.
Yeah, it's hard when it's someone
Great
you
folks.
care
I'm going
about.
to give a shout out here.
Okay.
I don't do this very often, but I'm going to give a shout out to, here on It Matters Radio, we find our guests in many different ways. One of the ways is that sometimes a publicist will contact us. There's a gentleman named Harlan Bowl, and he's just a lovely guy, and
Yeah.
one of the good guys, and he was the one who contacted me. And this morning, actually, we were scrambling around because we were having some trouble with Skype. And, like a real mensch, Harlan immediately jumped on the problem, helped us solve it. And I like to give a shout out to the people who make a difference to It Matters Radio.
Harlan has been so wonderful about this book. Harlan's of German ancestry. His father fled the Nazis for political reasons. And he I think when he read the book, he said, Harlan Ball is the only thing I've got in common with Bob Hope, because Harlan's been doing this so long and so wonderfully. He was Bob Hope's PR agent.
Yeah.
And he's really kind of worked to get what a lot of people think would be a sad and depressing book, but it's really an uplifting book, sort of out there so people can learn about it.
And
It's
they need
upsetting.
to.
It's upsetting. It's not depressing. It is uplifting, but it's upsetting. I guess most stories of human endurance and strength and courage and team spirit and all, they have to start in a dark place. And the dark place can upset, even while we are exalted by the positive. And I think that's the story. That's of your book. And again, folks, read it.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
we don't want to give too many spoilers here.
No.
Read it. Stan, thanks so much for joining.
And it's been a pleasure. I think we only scratched the surface on some of those topics.
Yes.
And once again, I hope I didn't talk too much. As a law professor, once I get wound up, I just start going like there's a class taking notes.
I'd rather have you talk too much and not at all. No, it
I
was
love
great.
when I guest talk, and I don't have to push too hard. I can
right.
sit back and actually learn something. So Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And folks, remember, we have this show because it really does matter.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.